We'd like to welcome Commander John Sharpe.
Hey, thank you, Father. That's way too much to live up to. Listening to the bio, it's probably the same as with everyone. It's all slightly overblown, and if you knew the backstory behind all of it, you'd just say, that's ridiculous. But it's very flattering. I appreciate it. Very generous. Thank you all for having me. I'm glad you came tonight. I've been threatened a couple of times by people who I won't mention. I'll just look at you. Then the individual's not even listening right now, so move it up, Commander. Yes, boss, that's what I say. Yes, dear, that's my normal line. So I'm told I have to be good tonight and give you something to think about. So we have 60 minutes, roughly 50, can I do math? 56 minutes. My wife says, you used to drive a submarine, can't you find the mayonnaise? It's like right there on the door of the fridge. So 56 minutes to get through the just war doctrine of the church and of what I would say sort of natural reason, the classical thought we get from Greece and Rome, which the church then took and gave to us, as I'm sure you've heard from Father and all his speakers, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, all the great minds of the church. And just war doctrine comes to us through that tradition. Question, of course, is why is it relevant? I mean, how does it affect any of us in this room? And in one respect, unless you're in the military on the verge of being deployed, kind of doesn't. You can kind of sit on the sidelines and say, well, Uncle Sam's going to war all the time. Thank you for your service. Put some quarters in the veterans donation box. Feel like a patriot. Okay. On the other hand, we're talking about life and death. We're talking about taking lives. You think of the death penalty. It's an opportunity for the state to take a life. Is it justified or not? I think you're trying to line up a talk maybe on the death penalty, so I won't spoil that for you. But when you're talking about taking life, it's grave. We hear the next speaker, I guess, is on the abortion topic, if I'm correct, Father. So that's an easy one for Republicans, conservatives, right-wingers. Call yourselves what you may, if that's even the right label. I don't really use those labels anymore at this stage in my life. But that's an easy one. The innocent child in the womb, it shouldn't be killed. End of discussion. It's not complicated. War is much more complicated. Death penalty is much more complicated. But as we know from the Catechism of Trent, the fifth commandment, if you all will make sure you're awake, the fifth commandment is thou shalt not. Thank you. Excellent, Father. Excellent work. Excellent pastoral work. Very good. Okay, number 5, commandment 5. Roman numeral looks like a V. The Trent Catechism says, except in 3 circumstances: legitimate self-defense, legitimate meaning lawful, necessary, it's all the conditions that go with that. The second is death penalty. If the state, this was, I told you I wasn't going to give you the punchline, but if I were, I would say that the traditional position of the church is that the state can take a life under the right circumstances. And then the third is killing, and Trent says, in a just war. And interestingly, Trent says nothing else other than killing in a just war does not violate the fifth commandment, leaving a lot to the imagination or your knowledge of history or knowledge of doctrine, your moral theology manuals that we were looking at today in Father Young's library. So just by a show of hands to keep this kind of loose, and I appreciate your feedback, and don't hesitate to interrupt with denunciations or rotten fruit or whatever you have handy. Who, show of hands, who has heard of the term just war doctrine? I'm assuming it's a fair number. Okay, and of the hands, so those hands down, please. Thank you. Good job, Aaron. Of the hands that didn't go up, I'm interested, and I guess there's not time for this dialogue, but I'm interested in why you're here tonight. It's one thing if you've heard about it, I'd like to hear more. Never heard of it before. Is it a question of curiosity? Like, well, what is the just war doctrine? Never heard of that. Can I get any feedback? Is that kind of the deal? So, with a topic like this, addressing an educated group like this, but a group where the level of education or exposure is different, it's tricky to pack. Here's my notes, from earlier today. I have to have notes just so I feel like I have notes. I don't follow them usually. To figure out, okay, where do we start where we don't risk talking to the intellects and telling them for 55 minutes what they already know, versus, on the other hand, those who say, you're way ahead, like I don't even know, stop, what do you mean by scholastic theology or philosophy? So I'll do my best to hit the sweet spot, but I encourage you, if I use a term or say, okay, this is obvious, I'm moving on, please interrupt, and if we don't have time, if I say, well, that we have to do a 3-hour lecture just to get that premise down, we'll move on. But please, I'm very serious, don't hesitate to interrupt or ask questions in the meantime. I have a bullet here, a little about me. The only thing I want to say is that I'm flattered that you would come to listen to me because you don't know me, you don't know who I am. The bio is nice, but it doesn't mean a whole lot. I got in the Navy in the 90s from the Naval Academy. In high school, Reagan was the president. So the big thing in the 80s before going to college was the Soviets. It's the United States versus the Soviet Union. United States good, Soviets bad. Every kid who was 16 in the 1980s thinks, let's just go kill communists. That's the American rah-rah mentality. My father was military. I met a number of you who are either federal service or military or grandparents, parents, etc., military. That's kind of the American way, is we just join the military and we take care of our enemies. So that was my mentality coming into the Naval Academy. My father warned me. He was in the Army in 1950-ish, 51, 52. I think he got out in 53. He, like I did, went into the military with great aspirations, especially for a man. Now, I will say, to try to keep this provocative, I don't believe women have any place in the military, leaving aside the nurses and secretaries and all that. But in general, it's for Catholics, it shouldn't even be something to talk about. If that's controversial, please assault me afterwards and we'll talk about it. But for men especially, it's cool things to fool around with. There's this masculine sense of taking on your enemies, certain sense of sacrifice, dying for the nation. And all young men seem to me have that kind of aspirational sense, which is why a lot of people come to me either themselves as older teenagers or in their 20s, or parents with children at that age. My son wants to go in the military. What do you think? And I find it sad. I'll give it away. Part of the punchline is I usually have to say it's not a place for Catholics anymore. Now, it may not ever have been in recent history, but not now, for several reasons. One, which would probably not be controversial, is the entire woke culture of the liberalism. You heard it, the transgender topic was last month, right, Father? Or month before that. So the military is always, sadly, these days, Department of Defense, our executive branch, is always on the cutting edge of revolutionary social change. They're pushing radical diversity, radical, mixing of gender identities, mixing of, there's this constant overemphasis on race. All of the stuff that you hear from the current Secretary of Defense, Hegseth, who I'm not super impressed with as a person. I mean, there's some things we could talk about, with him. He's not necessarily the model statesman, but I can't say I object to his effort to clean out a lot of this hyper diversity, which is not just fairness. It's not just treat people fairly, don't worry about the color of their skin. It goes way beyond that. And the military is soaked with that now, and it's just not a place for Catholics. The second thing, that's contemporary, very current last few decades. The second thing, generally speaking, is the military is not what one would call a school of the virtues. It's full of vice, and the most of the vice is, we'll do another quiz here quickly, 6th and 9th commandment. 6th commandment being, thou shalt not commit. Thank you. A little louder, thou shalt not commit. Okay, good. And I don't mean you're in favor of it because you're getting loud. The 9th commandment, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Okay, good. Which is odd because it really means wife and husband, right? It works both ways. 6th and 9th commandment are not at the forefront of the mind of most men in the military. And now when the military is crawling with women, they're the old joke, I guess, is when they first let women on ships, a number of them would come home pregnant and everyone would say, oh, we don't know how this is happening. And if anyone ever seen the movie A Man for All Seasons?
Yes.
About Thomas More? Just a quick show of hands, because that's Father. I don't know if you do movie nights, but that would be something to kick off. That's Paul Scofield. Orson Welles played Cardinal Wolsey, and there's a great line in there. Wolsey and Thomas More are having a debate about the fact that Henry VIII can't have an heir as a son because the children from Catherine of Aragon, as we know from our history, are all dying. And Wolsey's very concerned that the Tudor dynasty is going to die out if Henry can't have a son. And he says to Thomas More, the king needs an heir. What are you going to do about it? And Thomas More says, well, I'm sure he doesn't need advice from me on what to do about it, which is the same answer to how are all these women coming home pregnant off of the ships? Well, because you put 20-year-olds together and that's what happens. It's natural. So that environment, that side of it is no good. It's not a place to practice virtue. At best, you could say it's a gigantic near occasion of sin where you're going into that environment, perhaps with a certain lack of humility, thinking, oh, it's no big deal, I can resist that. Assuming you want to live as a Catholic, a genuine, sincere, virtuous Catholic in the first place, which is not, that I don't think that goes, excuse me, it doesn't go without saying today. The third issue, however, which may be controversial, I hope it is a little bit just to make this interesting, is that the likelihood is you are going to end up in an unjust war. If you're in the military today, eventually, it stands to reason. I don't have a crystal ball, I can't say for sure, but it stands to reason that eventually you will be sent to do something, to take military action against a target, as in people who do not deserve to be killed. And then the question comes back, well, commander says who? The president or whoever commands the military tells us to go do this. We follow orders, we do what we're told. Who put you in charge, as in me, to say that the people on the receiving end of our ordinance don't deserve to be killed? And the answer to that is what you've all been waiting for, why those of you who have never heard of just war doctrine came tonight, which is we know, as Catholics at least, from the just war doctrine, that there are rules for war. And there's two sets of rules for war. In the Old Latin, the word jus, which is the beginning of the word justice, also means law or right. So the classical writers, and I mean not before Christ classical as in Greek and Roman, but also those that follow in their footsteps, Augustine, St. Thomas, etc., into the period of the Church Fathers in the Middle Ages, they use the term jus to refer to a right or a legal permission for some act to be done. So there is jus ad bellum. Bellum is the word, we get the word belligerent from bello in Latin, means war. So jus ad bellum is the law or the rules for when one goes to war. And they answer a very simple question: when is it lawful or proper, moral, correct, right, fill in the blank, for a nation to go to war? That's what the part of the just war doctrine that deals with jus ad bellum, the rules for going to war. The second set is jus in bello. So in bello is just the different Latin declension for when you're already in war, are there rules for the conduct of war? And we know that there are, popularly, because we have things like the Geneva Convention. When I was on active duty, and we've got a few active duty, at least one person here recently on active duty or reserves, we have an ID card, and there's a little box, and it says Geneva Convention category what? And there's different categories. Geneva Conventions are just treaties made by the nations around the World War II timeframe for how combatants and how civilians and how prisoners and how certain other categories of people should be treated by belligerent powers. Belligerent meaning involved in a war. Usually there's two sides, sometimes there's more than two sides, but everyone involved in a war has some kind of, at least a concept, it's not honored frequently, but there's a concept of how the soldiers should behave, how civilians are to be treated, and how the prisoners are to be treated. And that's Geneva Conventions, and I mention it only because it is an example of how the concept for us, for we humans, all throughout history, is that there, even when we're making war, and when we're killing people and destroying property, with the kind of blanket of permission to do that, there's always rules. And again, whether the rules are followed is a separate problem that we'll get into. So just quickly, everyone with me so far? So far, so good? So it's because I want to make sure that we're all, kind of synced up on this. So as we mentioned, the war is the war-making power is an exception to the prohibition from the Catechism of Trent and basic Catholic moral teaching that thou shalt not kill, right? It's that simple. War is an exception to that. but the Catechism says just war. What I will tell you, and I said a little bit about me, so my military background put me in the Navy. I was at the Pentagon when we decided to go into Iraq in 2003. For reasons I won't waste the time getting into, I was gravely skeptical of that war and became more and more uncomfortable that we were prosecuting that war. And I got highly uncomfortable as I saw the number of our kids coming back either in body bags or missing limbs or missing pieces of skulls or whatever. And I'll tell you a very quick story. Anyone have a timer, by the way? The clock is good, right, Father? I need to watch the clock, so I don't want to get in any trouble. But they would bring these young men, all men from what I remember, from Walter Reed, which is the National Medical Center that's famous because that's where they do the medical care for the president. It's north of D.C. Now it's in Bethesda. They've moved it around, but basically it's the Washington, D.C. headquarters for military medicine, and they have supposedly the most cutting-edge technology for dealing with trauma. The amputees are treated there, the ones that have serious problems. They can work miracles, which is another problem in a manner of speaking, because go back to the Civil War era, if you are unfortunate enough to get injured in war, you're probably going to be lucky enough to have a priest hear your confession, and then you'll die and it'll be over with, and you don't live with missing legs and missing arms and all kinds of worse things, not just physical but psychological. So they would bring the most serious wounded from Walter Reed every so often, maybe every 2 months, to the Pentagon. They would notify all of us sitting at our computer terminals, in the cubicle, doing vital work for American national security. And we'd get a notice, 10 a.m., meet out in corridor, whatever the label was. So we would all traipse out there. It'd be a mix of senior, junior enlisted, middle management officers, mid-grade, Army majors, Marine lieutenants, etc., plus very high-ranking generals and admirals, 2, 3, 4 stars would come out. We would all line the corridor, and they would bring a parade of wounded in, which is what they called it, 20 or 30 young men, mostly in wheelchairs or worse contraptions, missing legs, missing arms, bandages, eyeballs missing. The casualties of war, like this was up close and personal, and you look at the human carnage and you think, none of them looked happy, needless to say. They didn't look happy in terms of what had happened to them, but I don't get the sense that they were happy. I never talked to any of them, that they were happy to be sort of put on display in that way. Because the question is raised, well, what is this exercise for? Is it designed to honor them because they would prefer to be left alone? I mean, no one in that position really wants to be made a spectacle of. Or is this for us? Is this to get us to back this? Because for me, it was highly counterproductive. I was not in favor of it to begin with. And then I see that and I think, well, whatever we're doing, is it worth this cost? And I tell you that story because that got me into not a lifetime, but a very intense period of research, trying to get to the bottom of, well, what does the church teach? I find, by the grace of God, and I think this applies to all of us, usually your first instincts are pretty sound, and then sometimes you feel like, well, I've got to go get the juice to back up this instinctive reaction. Because you will get responses from people. I don't know if any of you, and just a show of hands, this is not taking pot shots, and I'll close my eyes if you want. I won't look. Who had their doubts about the war in Iraq, as it was this is 20 years ago now, but it's a kind of what we'd say 15%. And those of you whose hands didn't go up later on, did you become skeptical? So even now, there's not what I would like to see is every hand go up. Yes, we knew it was nonsense from the beginning, and it was confirmed later. So even today, there's still some ambivalence, to say the least. But my instinct, I have to be honest with you, was very negative. I read a lot, because of my kind of political upbringing as a young man. Mom and Dad were constantly watching all the political talk shows, all the Sunday morning, and that was in my old Novus Ordo days. So we had to go to Mass Saturday night because we got to see those talk shows Sunday morning. And we would watch William Buckley and the McLaughlin Group and Bob Novak and all these guys talking politics. So I was attuned to that. But I also was reading widely enough that I would get kind of alternative perspectives. So there was actually a lot of coverage in the years from the early 90s, where the first Gulf War under President George H.W. Bush, up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, there was a lot of coverage of this whole question of whether Iraq and Saddam in particular and his government were pursuing chemical, biological, nuclear weapons. They were not. I can tell you that for certain. They were not. There was a lot of talk about the fact that they were, just like there's a lot of talk about a current nation actively pursuing a nuclear weapons program. But whether that's true or false is highly relevant, because the argument from Uncle Sam going into Iraq was that Saddam has the capacity to produce weapons. You may remember, again, this is 20 plus years old, but there was very detailed discussions, just like we're hearing now about Iran, of certain kinds of uranium coming from Nigeria, certain tubes that they needed for their centrifuges, which is how you enrich uranium. You spin it very quickly and then it separates the parts of the atom. There was apparently this great detail that our intelligence community purported to possess about Saddam pursuing these weapons. If it's not true, then your case for the war collapses, and we'll get into how that fits into the Catholic just war framework. But I knew enough at the time to know that it was fishy. I encountered partly the same reaction I encountered even here just now, where half or a larger part of the group is like, nah, I don't know, I think it was fine. I mean, what would, if I could just get another show of hands, and I want you to feel honest, no one's being put on the spot. For those whose hands didn't go up regarding the skepticism toward the war in Iraq, if I were to ask, were you positively in favor of it, thinking like, yes, this should be done and it's necessary? Can we see a show of hands there? So there's 1, 2, so much smaller. So then that leaves 50% maybe who either just don't believe in answering questions during talks, don't want to put their hands up, or kind of like, just don't know, not sure. So, but thank you for the three of you being honest and saying, yes, we had to do it. So what's that, ma'am?
My grandson was in the group that took out bin Laden.
Okay, she said her grandson was in the group that took out bin Laden, which was much, much later. One of the SEAL teams, I assume.
Yes.
Yes. So at the time, if you remember, to oppose that war was considered bad news. It was very unpatriotic. You were not supportive of the government. You were just a bad American and basically a bad person. Like, you can't question that. And you were lumped in with leftists like Noam Chomsky and others who were they're just bad in general. So just go over with the bad group. But there was not a lot of serious discussion at the time about what is the actual case for war and how does it fit into this framework, which even half of us tonight have said we don't really know what that framework is. So the capacity to evaluate whether that was the right thing was frankly non-existent. Move ahead to the next, let's get into sort of this framework so we can talk about how all this fits together. And again, I wanted to go back to the bio thing. I keep coming back to that because the only thing I have to offer you tonight, aside from this probably excessively flattering note from Father at the beginning, is this whole kind of almost introspection that I'm sharing with you is what kicked off the stack of books on the back table there on your far right are 2 volumes of a book called Neocon. Of course, I do believe and came to believe that the neoconservatives in our government were pushing the agenda to get us into war in Iraq for reasons we might touch on a bit later, but again, that's a subject of a whole other discussion. So we thought neocon was a cutesy title because we felt the American people were conned into supporting the war with these claims of weapons of mass destructions, and the neoconservatives were behind it, so clever neocon. 2 gigantic volumes, one 400 some pages, the other almost 900. 80 essays by probably 60 or 70 different authors. But our goal was to start with the Catholic premise and the Catholic foundation. What is the just war doctrine? Is there such a thing as a moral approach to the question of going to war? And for me, as an old-fashioned, serious, I would say, hyper-traditional Catholic, that's part of a larger question, which I know you get a lot of here from Father and from the speakers and from just his general catechizing of all of you, that we look back to the ages of faith, the Middle Ages, when church doctrine was not considered something in a side room or that you get here to talk about and then you would ignore it for the rest of the week, but it was a vision that inspired the organization of society as a whole. And there was not the expectation in many centuries ago that your religious views were something that had to be kept out of public life. Today, the phenomenon is if you're in business, say, well, that's just business. I don't let my religion get in the way of that. I'm not saying that's your view, but that's the modern secular view. The same thing with government. You remember Kennedy had to say very clearly, in effect, I'm paraphrasing, and I think this is a bit unfair, but for purposes of illustration, as he was coming into office, running for the, down the home stretch of being elected, 1959, 1960, he makes the appearance in Dallas saying, I'm not going to be your president as a Catholic. In other words, I'll leave my religion out of it. Now, I actually don't think he did that. This is highly controversial about Kennedy. But the idea that in order to become a serious figure in government, that you have to basically make a pledge with your citizens, I promise not to act as a Catholic. Well, that's a big problem. And you can't imagine Louis IX of France in the 1250s saying, well, I'm going to govern France, but I'm not going to do it as a Catholic, right? It doesn't make any sense. And I think we have Wenceslas feast coming up in the next week or so, a king, not just a confessor, but there's all through the church's calendar, there are kings, and part of what the church celebrates about the kings is that they acted as Catholics and they behaved virtuously as they were governing. So it is a secularist and frankly a kind of modernist and certainly liberal in the classical sense thought that religion has no role to play in governance or in economic life or in public life. So ultimately, that was my starting point when I thought in this whole question of going to war, the Catholic vision should play a part in that analysis. That's the bottom line. And we had started the business of reproducing old texts, Hilaire Belloc, Chesterton, names you're probably familiar with, little reprints from books 100 years old that we thought were worth being in print. So I get out, and I'll talk to you about this in a second. I get a book off my shelf by a Dominican German from 1926, maybe 28, don't hold me to the date, called The Church and War. The Dominican's name is Francis Stratman, Strattman, or Tmann, something to that effect. And he goes through the traditional teaching on war. It's a 200-page book. He starts with the Greeks, the Romans, the New Testament, and then into all the Catholic thinkers up to the 1920s. And he comes up with a synthesis of what is the church's position on war. And not so much the church as an ecclesiastical body, but what do Catholics believe? What does the church teach? And what must Catholics believe on war? And he lays out a few very important criteria, which I'll tell you about in a second. Reading that book, I tell my wife, wow, this is great. She says, why don't you reprint it? That's what you do. Oh, good point. Hadn't crossed my mind. We then realize that there's portions of this book that are not relevant. So we put those to one side, we pull the guts out of it, and then the project just takes off. We think, well, we need to look at the historical angle, because if you want to understand what the Middle East is like, you have to have some sense of history. One of the just war criteria, which I won't get into in detail because it's not one of the chief criteria, but one of them is if you're going to make war, you have to have a reasonable chance of success. In other words, you don't risk the injury, the destruction, the immorality that comes from war unless you're certain it will fix the problem you're trying to fix. And we know, think about our Afghanistan experiment. Into Afghanistan, 2001, out 2000, anyone remember the year? It was certainly under Biden, it was a big scandal how we left Afghanistan, but that's 2 or 3 years ago at the most. So basically 20 years of occupation to accomplish what? I can't state what we accomplished there, except we certainly got a lot of our people killed, wasted gobs and gobs of money that we in fact don't have. And as far as I know, the Taliban is still in charge, which was the original target. So that question of can you achieve your objective and do you have a chance of achieving your objective is vital, because that's achieving the objective is the only thing that would make the misery that comes from war worthwhile. So we looked at the history of it. You have to understand the history to find out if what you're trying to do is going to work. We wanted the politics. I got into some of these little tidbits about, is the weapons of mass destruction claim actually true? How can you know that? The other thing that we found as we started pulling more and more essays together, and the project, as you can see from the size of it, definitely got out of control. I was criticized by my co-editor saying, you're never going to stop this project. Well, there's just one more point that we need to fit in here. That's why it's as big as it is. We also started to find that the critics of going into Iraq were about equally situated, if you will, on both the left and the right. So you had Pat Buchanan, the famous old conservative, the Reaganite from, you'll remember his speech at the Republican convention in 1992. It was one of the most solid presentations, I think, from a modern American politician in history. I mean, I recommend you go back and listen to it. It's got to be on the internet somewhere. But it talked about the cultural war, and it was very much old traditional values. And old Pat Buchanan was trying to get those into the mainstream, and he couldn't succeed for reasons we could talk about another time. But he was very much against the war in Iraq. Tom Fleming, anybody, we're out in the Midwest, so anyone read Chronicles? Does that journal mean anything to anyone? There's a place in Rockford, which I don't know how far Rockford is from here, but it can't be, it's closer than it is to me normally, being from Maryland. Rockford Institute is a very serious hub, if you will, of traditional conservative thought. Not expressly Catholic, but again, very much these old world values. They were all very negative. Tom Fleming was the man in charge of it at the time. Sam Francis was another famous editorial writer. Sobrand, everyone remember the name Joe Sobrand, of course. All of these old, what they would call paleo-conservatives, old-fashioned conservatives, were very skeptical towards the war. At the same time, you have numerous what we would call lefties coming out. Noam Chomsky being the most, I mentioned him earlier in kind of a less flattering setting. Chomsky was violently against the war. And for those who would be tempted to say, well, just discount anything he says because that's not a man we listen to, you actually read his argument and say, well, guess what? It's the same argument that the conservatives are making. So the second volume of those books, the largest one, which looks at more of the politics and kind of looks at how did Americans react to this effort to get us into Iraq, you'll find that it's evenly divided 50-50, half conservatives, half leftists, and they're all making the same arguments. So that's something else, that I want to leave with you tonight, and that I certainly learned over many years of study and following all this. Don't let us not allow ourselves to be pigeonholed into the left versus right, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal mentality. Because what you have, and I'll do a couple of punchlines here just in case we can't get into the deep exploration of some of these things that we would like to with more time. What I'm going to leave you with is probably going to be unsettling and maybe not very popular. I don't think that the way we're told to think about the Israeli, Iranian, and American conflict in the media, I don't think that's correct. I don't think that the United States has any justification to get involved in that. I think the Iranians have every right to defend themselves from Israeli aggression. I'll defend that thesis later, but that's the punchline to try to maybe get your blood going a little bit. The same thing with Ukraine, Russia. Father and I were talking last night. That's an interesting topic. We hear Putin bad, Zelensky good, Americans good, NATO good, Poland good, France, Germany, England good, Russia bad. I don't think that stands up to scrutiny at all. I think the facts do not support that position. But the reason I bring up those two examples is because the conservatives are expected typically to be on one side, and the nuts are the ones who have all the, either the pro-Russia sentiment, or they're tolerant of Russia, or they're not sufficiently hostile to Russia. And the same thing with Iran and Israel. It's the conservatives that tend to back Israel all the time, and it's the what would we say to take the page out of the World War II? It's the accommodationists, the Neville Chamberlain, the kind of like, oh, you're just giving in, you're making peace, and eventually you're going to lead us to war. So we have to come down on these people like a ton of bricks. We have to take the fight to the Persians and the Arabs in the Muslim world, and we have to take the fight to the Russians. I believe most of that kind of dialogue is driven not by facts and not by the, none of us have 18 or 24 months to write 2 books that are 1,400 pages long studying every conflict. It's impossible. And that's kind of how we're moved, by the media and by the buzzwords, if you will, and the bumper sticker presentations we get from the news to move us in certain ways. But I believe the bulk of that problem is that if you identify as a conservative, which is understandable in one sense, you're opposed to transgenderism, you're opposed to hyper wokeism in terms of race, you're opposed to open borders and unlimited immigration, you're opposed to the state trying to run the economy, all the things that conservatives typically oppose, So you move in that direction, and then you're told, by the way, you must support Israel at all costs, even if they're committing a genocide in Gaza or attacking the Iranians for no reason. You say, well, I guess if I'm a conservative, that's what I do. Because if you shop around for the party that would be critical of what the Israelis are doing in Gaza, or not ready to rush to war with the Iranians, or not ready for Uncle Sam to back the Israelis in a war with the Iranians, you are with, forgive me for those of us that have, extended family that fall into this category, but you're with kind of the purple hair, tranny, crazy people who you think, well, they can't, I don't like anything about them. They can't be right. So if those are the only people talking about the suffering in Gaza or about not wanting war with Iran, then I'll run from that side and jump back into the other camp. And that is the worst possible thing that can be done to the human intellect, I believe, is to say, don't look at the facts and don't study your principles and don't come to an independent conclusion. Repeat whatever you're told about the camp that you think you're in or that you've placed yourself in. So that's one of the takeaways that we, I believe, achieved with those books, but more importantly that I want to leave you with as a, sort of a halfway or partly through halfway in the talk. I beg you to think critically about what messages you're receiving from the mainstream media, and don't let the media or your colleagues, extended family, whatever, pigeonhole you into positions that you feel you must take because you've identified with this party or that party, this group or that group. Does that make sense, everyone, what I'm saying? I hope it does. And I certainly accept that it is potentially controversial, but that was the grandeur of the Middle Ages and the Catholic ages of thought, was there was constant controversy. The entire doctrine of the church was worked out with precision as a result of controversy. We survived the great heresies because of controversy, but the controversy, in addition to some wars, I admit that, anyone know about the Albigensians, that didn't end, on fully peaceful terms. But generally speaking, a lot of the questions that are key for Catholics were worked out in controversy, debates. In the Middle Ages, they called it a disputation. There's a thesis, you have one person represent one side, one person represent the other side. And the reason, as a quick digression, they say that Thomas, of all the thinkers in the church, was the best, was because he could most accurately understand and represent the positions of his opponents. And many of his opponents, when Thomas would write about a school of thought that he was writing against, would say, you, Thomas, have captured what I think better than I could put it into words. And that's the way Catholics operate, is we operate with a certain openness and candor towards ideas. We try to lay out the ideas of our opponents in the fairest possible terms and the most accurate possible terms, and then we examine, are those principles true or not? And that's what the just war doctrine is, that it looks at every conflict through that lens. So we'll take a 30-second break, kind of regroup where we're at. I've thrown a lot at you, but I want to give you the key points of the just war doctrine and then kind of see where we go from there. So we talked about these two groups of principles that involve the war-making power. I'll probably focus for the remaining of the time on the question of going to war. I would hope that we're all agreed that once a war is started, we all at least have a concept that war should be civilized. These jus in bello principles, the principles that govern the making of war and the conduct of war, are designed to civilize something that's inherently barbaric. And we know from history that it's gotten worse. I think the anecdote or the bumper sticker, if you will, is Sherman's march through Georgia with the burning everything down and terrorizing the populace. The pro-Lincoln Yanks up here in this part of I have to remember, I'm north of the Mason-Dixon line, aren't I? So I got to be a little careful. I beg your pardon. I'm from Maryland. We would have seceded, except Lincoln had the legislature arrested before we got to vote. It's true. I'm not kidding. So I understand that there's an argument on the other side. The pro-Sherman argument is people they just needed it. The war had to come to an end, and some people just don't understand any message than terror. That's basically the defense of our action in Nagasaki and in thank you. Is that the Japanese just wouldn't quit. Now there's, I think, numerous historical questions that have been raised since that time to say that that's perhaps not true. But that's the argument. I understand there's arguments. But the reality is that certainly over the last 2 centuries, the conduct of war has become more and more inhuman and less civilized. We do know from the ages of faith that when there were 2 Catholic countries fighting it out, by and large, and I don't mean to say they were flawless or beyond reproach in any way, but they did observe what we know as the truce of God and the peace of God, where certain feast days there was no fighting, certain times of night there was no fighting. The church, we also know from history, she's constantly issuing proclamations against new forms of weaponry. When the longbow was invented, by, I believe, the English, they're usually up to no good when it comes to war. 1,000 years ago, the church roundly condemned it. The church didn't like the appearance of gunpowder on the scene. In volume 1 of the book, I believe I was going to share this with you, it's appendix 3, if I'm not mistaken. The 3 appendices really are worth the book itself. Appendix 3 is an excerpt from a book by a professor named Romano Amerio. Anyone familiar with that name, Amerio? Of course Aaron is, and Father Young. So Amerio was a peritus at Vatican II. So he was one of the philosophical and theological experts that would have been attached to a bishop who goes to Vatican II, and he turns to his expert, that's just the Latin term for expert, to get advice on how to edit and reformulate and capture the documents that are being worked on for the Council Fathers at Vatican II. So Amerio was one of these periti, an expert working for a bishop, I believe Swiss, but don't quote me on that. So obviously super genius in terms of intellect and his sense of church history. Well, he writes a book after the council, probably 20 years after the council, called Iota Unum, from our Lord's comment in the scripture that he won't change a single iota of the law. And Amerio takes I'll be honest with you, an extremely critical look at Vatican II, saying that in general, whether you want to nitpick the language of the documents, the general spirit that comes out of Vatican II is much more liberal, and it's very loosey-goosey from the standpoint of solid, true Catholic tradition, which we were comfortable with for the 1,500 some odd years before that. The point for right now is that in this book, Iota Unum, it's as big as the big book of the Neocon volumes, and it is absolutely worth the read. It's not a polemic, it's not a traddy, screed against Vatican II or the new Mass or whatever. It is a very deep, dispassionate, calm, and frankly refreshing look at modernity, frankly. He says, what is it about the 60s and 70s where things seem to have gone so crazy compared to this stability that was in the church before? But one of the chapters is on war. And I absolutely, I can't commend it to you in high enough terms that he talks about this thing we were going on, the continued and worsening belligerence in war. So from Amerio, we get a lot of the principles about the church constantly trying to condemn new inventions and new technologies so that men can better kill one another. And it's common sense, we would expect the church to do that. I've got off onto the appendices for a reason. I want to mention the other 2. One we already talked about, which is Stratman. That's basically where he lays out the actual key principles of just war doctrine based on his historical study. Here's another interesting one. Anyone remember the name Ottaviani, Cardinal Ottaviani? Of course, Aaron does. So Ottaviani was another big figure from Vatican II. He was at Vatican II, Italian, of course, like many of the cardinals. He was, his claim to fame is that under Pius XII, so Pius XII's reign ended in 1958. So let's say the period from 39, I believe, is when he came in. Correct me. 39 to 58 is Pius XII, and then John the 23rd is around when Vatican II is convened. So Ottaviani runs at that time what's called the Holy Office, and the Holy Office was what you now know as the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which is the branch of the Curia, the church's sort of ecclesiastical governing establishment that does doctrine. So if there's a question, there's a heretical professor at Catholic U somewhere teaching something about tranny this or denying the resurrection or Our Lady's Immaculate Conception or whatever, it's the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. In the old days, the Holy Office that would scrutinize this man's teaching and eventually, if he refuses to reform, say, you're defrocked, you're removed from your position or no longer allowed to have a public ministry. It's the police office for doctrine, for the purity of doctrine. So Ottaviani was running this office for Pius XII. And to give you a sense of the history, how serious they took it, the Holy Office is the more recent name. There's a new one now, as I said. The more recent name for the Holy Office of the Inquisition. That's where it came from the Middle Ages, was looking into questions of heresy. And as I said, it's what the church does. She has the doctrine she received from our Lord, and when people start to go off the rails, she scrutinizes what they teach, what they're teaching, and she gives them either a pass or fail. So in Volume 1, Appendix 2, we have an excerpt from a work that we found by Ottaviani in Latin, 2 big volumes, very egghead academic volumes, called The Public Law of the Church. This is Cardinal Ottaviani writing about church law, but the second volume is, how does the church interface with society? And in many respects, we're right back to the just war doctrine. Can the church give us a moral doctrine that applies to matters of politics and government and international relations? As I said, Middle Ages would not have hesitated to respond to that question. Well, of course she does, because as Catholics, we're in society, we're governors, we're legislators, we're judges, we're manufacturers, we're employees, we're teachers, you name it, but we're Catholics, and we act as Catholics at all times without any question. It's kind of the American and the liberal idea, as I said, where we hang all that stuff up, we come to work, take off our coat, take off our hat, take off our religion, put it in the closet, 8 hours of work, put it all back on and go home. That's the modern idea. It's not the Catholic idea. So Ottaviani, in as recently as 1945, which is quick math, 80 years ago. Thank you, 80 years ago. I'm glad you're paying attention. It's a relief. I won't say refreshing, but it's a relief, because I always worry about that. 80 years ago, Ottaviani's writing this very deep canon lawyer, philosopher, historian, head of the department in the church that looks after Catholic doctrine worldwide. And he has a section in his last book that says, modern war is to be absolutely forbidden. This is Ottaviani. This is not a liberal. This is not a lefty. This is not, excuse my expression, not a tranny, not one of these crazy leftist protesters. This is Cardinal Ottaviani, who in 1945 is as Catholic as it gets. And the old joke, you could say, well, are you more Catholic than the Pope? Ottaviani would say, yeah, probably I am. And so the title of this chapter, Modern War is to be absolutely forbidden. Let me just read you one paragraph from this, because this is profound. At least it was profound for us. Every effort should be made to establish the existence of whatever right is being claimed. So let me translate that and give you the most essential principle of just war doctrine. The just war doctrine assumes that a nation will at some point decide to make war. Just like a judge may decide to administer the death penalty, or in a split-second decision, you come home from work, your wife or child or something is being attacked, and you have to use potentially lethal violence to repel that attack. Those are the 3 cases, right, we talked about from Trent. When is it okay to take a life? Self-defense, just war, and capital punishment. So in each of those 3 cases, some actor, some individual is taking it upon himself to decide, at this moment, I can take a life. The self-defense sometimes requires a split-second decision, so the moral theologians would give you a little more slack. And if you get called up on murder charges, one of the ways to get out of it, I'm not trying to give you any tips, is strictly, what's the difference between self-defense and first-degree murder? First degree is premeditation. There's no premeditation, right? You're not planning a person's murder for 6 months and then just waiting for the occasion when it looks like self-defense. If it's self-defense, it's split second, and you have a lot of wiggle room there. Capital punishment should be different. We know there's capital cases where the governor's on the verge of sending someone to the electric chair, there's a petition filed, and maybe they're on death row for 20 years. A lot of us would be, I don't want to get into the next talk or whatever when you get your death penalty lecture. A lot of us, I think, as conservatives who are in that pigeonhole would be inclined to say, oh, what a waste, we're taxpayer dollars, we got to feed the guy all the time, and maybe he's getting a PhD and watching TV in the prison. But you're going to take a life, so my view is, especially given the incompetence of the modern state and modern bureaucracy, if plodding along for a few more years to make sure you're not killing the wrong guy is what it takes, that's probably okay. And I'm sure he appreciates it, his family appreciates it. The worst possible scenario is war, Or let's say the scenario where a hasty decision is most evil is in going to war. Because you have the whole machinery of the state, the intelligence department, the diplomatic department. So for us, it's state, CIA, DIA, NSA, NRO, National Reconnaissance Office, all the State Department connections with all the intelligence agencies around the world. This entire gigantic, expensive, and well-staffed machinery to get to the truth of whether one should go to war or not. There's no excuse for a hasty decision there. But if the decision is made to go to war, what's happening is a single nation, so take us for example, the United States, instead of going to court and filing a complaint and saying the other nation has done X, Y, or Z to us, we're opening a case, we're the plaintiffs, they're the defendant, we exchange briefings, we engage in discovery, at the end we decide, okay, what's the penalty? And there's some judge who's above the two nations who makes the decision. We don't have that today. We have the machinery of it in place with the UN and criminal courts and things like that, but the United States never has recourse to the UN to ask permission to go to war. As you know, Colin Powell tried that in 2003 when he went to the UN and said, I have this powder in my bag, this is chemical weapons from Saddam's lab, and the United Nations said, we don't buy it. We said, okay, fine, we'll go to war anyway. We don't pay attention to the United Nations for good or ill. But in a case where a nation takes it upon itself to go to war, think about what the nation is doing. The nation is acting, first of all, in like a law enforcement capacity, right? You're gathering information, you're building a case, you then pass that in a standard criminal case, you'd pass that to some prosecuting attorney or the DA. Is there enough to make a case? Well, we then in our government engage in that process of figuring out, do we need to go to war? Once that decision, yes, there's a case here. We have enough facts, enough evidence, enough intelligence that going to war might be necessary. As I said, we don't go to the judge. We go right from the intelligence gathering and the reflection to, yes, we're going to war, and then we take it upon ourselves to take another life. The risk there is that that decision tends to be what the lawyers would call either self-serving or a conflict of interest. If you want to go to war anyway, for instance, if there's a sea of oil in Iraq, which our friend Paul Wolfowitz talked about. He said, Iraq swims on a sea of oil. All the oil will pay for all of it. It's no big deal. Well, that raises the question, is it for the oil or is it for whatever this other claim is? First question. Sometimes there's minerals. We know there's a lot of stuff in Africa and elsewhere, Venezuela, oil and minerals. The third issue is, let's try to be provocative as we near the end, the question of Iran and Israel. What is Iran alleged to be doing right now? Iran is alleged not to have a direct and immediate plan to attack the United States. That's never been alleged. There's no evidence for it, but it's not even been claimed. No one has gotten on the news saying, we have tangible, real evidence that the Iranians have a fleet of ships that's headed towards the East Coast, or there's missiles in the air, or there's troops lined up, to get into these amphibious ships that are going to drive across the ocean. No one's alleging that the Iranians are going to attack us, first of all. No one is alleging that Iran possesses any kinds of weapons of mass destruction, to use the old phrase from Iraq. No nukes, no chemical weapons, no biological weapons. It is not even alleged that Iran has uranium that's been enriched to a level where they can produce a nuclear weapon, nor is it alleged that they are actively trying to go from a low-grade uranium to a more enriched grade of uranium. What it's alleged is they have the mindset of possibly maintaining the capacity to do that in the future. So that's the case that we would make then for going to war or for committing the aggression that we committed against Iran. And in my view is, and this is from Ottaviani and Stratman and Amerio and all the others, is that when a nation decides we are going to take another life, I think you'll have to remind me, Aaron, that I don't think there were casualties in this strike that we did against the Iranians about a month ago, right? I think those bunkers were empty. That's what we were told by the news, which is good because it's nice not to kill people. But had there been casualties there, or had we engaged in another strike or a wholesale invasion like we did in Iraq, it would be the United States and our government appointing ourselves, if you will, in the role of judge and jury. We feel that our rights of some kind, there's some grave violation of our rights, but instead of having recourse to authority, remember one of my notes here that I told you I wouldn't get to is, and this is all in the writers who talk about as just war doctrine has evolved into the modern era, It's not the Wild West anymore. If you live as a pioneer, you have a gun on your holster, a wagon, 2 cows, and that's it, and the Indians or the cattle rustlers come to get you. There's no sheriff, there's no police, there's no nothing. You have to take matters into your own hands. There's no question about that. That's like the instant self-defense when you come home, some family member's being assaulted. That's the immediate reaction that you don't have time to think about. The United States and any modern nation, when it decides to make war, especially in this era of no declarations of war, this isn't so much of a Catholic thing, but let's also bear in mind that in the old days there was an exchange of declarations of war, a solemn decree from one government to the other, almost a fair warning saying, we've declared war on you. I think World War II, that certainly happened. I don't think it's happened in this country. You all can correct me. It hasn't happened since World War II, has it? Certainly wasn't. Korea was done under the UN. Vietnam was nothing. A police action that killed 50,000 Americans and God knows how many Southeast Asians. The attacks on Serbia under Clinton, Iraq under first Bush, second Bush, Iran now. I'm sure I'm certainly missing a few. Libya under Reagan, Libya under Obama, Afghanistan under Obama. I mean, think of the list, like 10 different military actions that, where we Americans ourselves lost at least 100,000, if you do the math and add all those up. Not a single declaration of war. Not one moment where the most representative body gets together and says, we're going to go home and face our constituents having made a declaration of war. And I, for the life of me, I can speculate as to why that is, but it seems perplexing to me. And one throwaway point in the list of minor just war doctrine issues, all of the writers will add as a bullet point, it must be declared by legitimate authority. And in the era of Iraq, which I was so obsessed with, and still, as you can tell, probably haven't quite gotten over, one of the arguments from Catholics was, well, the President Bush, G.W. Bush, has evaluated the legitimacy of going to war. He's comfortable that we should go to war. If the president says do it, we're all good soldiers, not just the military, but Americans in general. We must trust that he's evaluated the just war criteria and give him the benefit of the doubt that this military action is justified. I don't know what anyone thought about Bush 43, but a scholar of the just war doctrine, I suspect he was not. So one of the other many critiques of the war-making powers as it's used most recently from the Catholic writers is the entire just war doctrine presumes that one is going to go through this logic. First of all, the restraint that comes with a nation sitting as judge and jury in its own case. That's the point I was driving at earlier, is you collect the evidence, but you don't go to the DA who then goes to a judge to get a conviction. You collect the evidence, make a decision, and go to war. And a lot of people end up getting killed. There's no sense that process is restrained by this reflection of Congress or the exercise of legitimate authority. What else can I leave you with? We're very short on time. But I want to emphasize. Let me just restate that point. This whole question of where the state's war-making power comes from, the analysis that it should go through, and the fact that there is no superior authority. I hope that's coming clear to you, because again, the best example is Wild West, where a gunslinger attacks the cattle rustlers because he has no choice. There's no police, there's no judge, there's nothing to go to. We behave as if that's the case now. And every modern state, not just the United States, that takes it upon itself to make war is evaluating its own case and taking action. Usually the arguments, and we're very close to closing time, so I'll just leave you with a few final thoughts on that point. Usually the arguments are, well, it's a state of necessity. It's absolutely necessary. Well, that then gets us back to the logic. We talked a little bit about Iraq. Think about Iran. The logic I walked you through before. There's no argument, and there has yet to be an argument from the United States that Iran is attacking the United States or planning an attack on the United States. What we get is the euphemisms, well, they might. Aaron, if you and I, God forbid, we ever get in a conflict, and I think, well, you might attack me, so I need to shoot you just to be safe. That shouldn't fly, in a normal court of law. And the judge would say, well, what's your excuse? You can say Aaron didn't like you, but is that really enough? Because that's usually our argument with another state. Well, he had some weapons. He has guns, and I know he's going to shoot me. And then Aaron, in his defense, says, well, no, I didn't have guns. I didn't have bullets. I was looking at a catalog thinking about buying some guns, or maybe getting myself some raw metal and some molten metal and some machines to make the guns. And this is how we behave towards other nations when we see them building weapons or contemplating developing weapons or whatever. And I don't think any of us step through the logic and figure out how many steps of removal are there from the argument that war is necessary versus what the actual fact is that's claimed at the beginning. There's a long series of steps. And all of this hard mental labor is what the just war doctrine is telling us to do. So in summary, to evaluate what is the actual cause for going to war, and can you rule out the nation that's making that decision, kind of short-circuiting that logic for other self-serving purposes? That's, again, one of the big dangers. The second is that there is no authority above the nation who two nations that are having a conflict can appeal to settle it. Now, you might guess that in the old days, in the ages of Christendom, that was the Pope. Between warring or conflicting Catholic states, the Pope played a tremendous role in what he would call arbitration. He didn't claim to rule the Catholic nations. He did claim to be able to arbitrate, to force the kings to sit down and, to the extent humanly possible, work out their differences without killing each other. One last point, which has been implied in everything, and then I'll close because I don't want to push my luck and run too far over, which I acknowledge I'm already just a bit over. I'll take my 2 minutes back, Father. I think I started 2 minutes late, and then I promised to be done. We have hinted, I think, in a roundabout way at another principle I want to mention, so that if you have to recite these for a quiz next week, in case Father really wants to stick it to you, one of the other buzzwords that you should put on his quiz is last resort. Again, I think we've talked about this in going through this logic, but the punishment of war is so grave and the evil so significant. It's loss of life. Every human life is precious. You know that from the abortion side of your conservative logic. The moral destruction. When men come home from war, their whole moral compass is shot because they're typically doing all day long, every day, things that normally in a proper moral world they shouldn't be doing. So the moral destruction on society, and frankly the 6th and 9th commandment depravity that comes from it is very hard to recover from. The harm of war is so significant that not only does the cause have to be fully justified, as in an imminent armed attack with solid evidence and solid persuasion from government that the government has evaluated not just what benefits the state and what benefits other secret interests, whether political or financial, but what is the actual moral claim? What is the moral good that's being vindicated? And at the end, you have the just cause, which is what would be pulling you towards war. You have the, we mentioned the legitimate authority, but then you have the last thing is this last resort, that before you get to that super hyper grave result, you have to be able to convince yourself that there's nothing else that can be done. And as Ottaviani mentions in his fantastic text, I think in this day and age, it seems to me, it's very difficult to ever say we've really reached that last resort, because we have the machinery of diplomacy, the machinery of destruction. And one last factoid, we know, if my memory is still clear on this, that the day, I think it was a Saturday, that the Americans, or actually I'm getting that wrong, I think it was the day that the Israelis started the attack against Iran. The Iranians were planning to have another diplomatic meeting, another round of diplomacy with the Americans and the Israelis. Probably Sunday was the day they were planning it, because I remember Sunday morning we got up on the way to Mass, look at the text, Israelis bombing Iran, oh great. Or maybe I'm getting that wrong. It was either Israel or Americans, because my memory of all this is sketchy, and I apologize for that. But the bottom line is the Iranians had every expectation that there was going to be another round of talks. And the reason they all hadn't run down to their bunkers is because 12 or 24 hours before that, the bombs started falling. But I just don't think the argument is credible that another round of talks, maybe it wouldn't have immediately solved the problem. If the American aim is to get the Iranians to pledge we'll never build a nuclear weapon, maybe that's achievable, maybe it's not. That's another topic. But would further discussion have at least paused the loss of life? Absolutely. And for everyone who was killed in the exchange of missile fire between Israel and Iran, would all those people rather still be alive? I suspect they would. And would all the family members like to have the family around? I suspect they would. So you think of these like competing pillars of just war doctrine, the just cause that pulls you to war, the consciousness of the gravity, the recognition that the state arrogates to itself the right to take a life, all of that then points to the last resort kind of bullet of the just war doctrine, which is don't do this in haste, and certainly don't fall for the media spin, which is trying to pigeonhole you into one faction, if you will, that's just constantly clamoring for war. Because that, I can submit to you anyway, my view is that that's not the Catholic spirit at all. So I appreciate your patience through working through a topic that's difficult and meaty. But thank you again for having me, and I hope it was of some use to all of you. Thank you so much. Yes, Father.
Using just war theory, help us understand
Yeah, so the question was the recent, probably the most recent example of American military action is the strikes on the Venezuelan boats. And I will confess, I'll say everything as tentatively as possible. I feel comfortable in my principles. My facts are very sketchy, so you all may be able even to shed some light on things that I'm missing. But the basic question is, what would be a just war approach to that? The first thing that's interesting is that the just war doctrine takes as a premise, because it's old-fashioned, that you have nations that are at war, and so if there's two kings are fighting over a piece of territory, one makes war on the other's nations, and usually there are not a tremendous amount of civilians involved in that. That's sort of the traditional just war doctrine assumes this kind of old-fashioned mindset. We Americans, at least since 9/11, and certainly before that, tend to be very good at the military actions that we euphemistically call police actions or strikes or military use of military force, whatever. When I mention Congress tends to abdicate its authority to declare war, what they tend to give is authorizations for the use of military force. So they'll pass a resolution that is of very questionable legal weight, because the Constitution provides for a declaration of war. And the purpose, that was very old-fashioned, as I said, in the sense of giving fair notice to your enemy. We don't want you, the other country, to keep doing what you're doing. Okay, negotiations not working. We really mean it, negotiations not working. We declare war. That's the country's chance to say, okay, in that case, uncle, let's come to the table. So the first point is, when that diplomatic effort, this is under the heading of the last resort, when your first resort is a missile strike, you've probably skipped over the last resort part, right? Because there is no last if there's no first. It's just the only resort is launch a missile. First point. Second point, I couldn't even begin to analyze the just cause type of thing, because when the just war writers say that the reason for going to war has to be grave, what I tried as best I could in the limited time is to explain this notion of where does the nation's right to make war come from. I didn't go into the details, but I'll do just a hint of that now. Give me a hand up, if you would, please, if you've ever heard of the church or the state referred to as a perfect society. Does that term in philosophy or history mean anything to you? So the contrast is the family versus the church and the state. The old writers, Thomas especially, but all the political thinkers would refer to a nation or a state as a perfect society. What that means is it's self-sufficient. All of the things that it needs to do its job, it has. It doesn't have to look outside of itself to get something done. The family is the best contrast. It's absolutely a society. There's a head, the deputy. I'm old-fashioned. I'm the boss. My wife is second in charge, and the kids are supposed to do what they're told. Very antiquated philosophy. It's a little society. There's a judge, a jury, a lawmaking power, law enforcement. But we're not self-sufficient. We have to go to the state for the larger good of education. We rely on the church to give us religion. We rely on all these other larger powers in society, if you will, to give us what we need. So that makes us imperfect. Reason I mention perfect society is because the theory is that the state has the right to go through this process I explained. We gather facts, we evaluate the facts. Ideally, we evaluate them against the just war principle, and then we decide to take a life. So the state takes on the role of a judge, if you will, because the state can't go anywhere else. The state has all of its power that it needs, and so the state, traditionally, the old authors would say, yes, the state does have the right and the power to decide we need to take the life of a group of foreigners to defend ourselves. As I've also said, in order to justify coming to that conclusion, the statesmen, who ideally are working with Catholic principles, they aren't today, they're ideally thinking, before I get to that point, I better be darn sure that what's happening to me is so bad that it warrants killing one person, 10 people, 100 people. I'm not sure how we could get to the point where however many, do we know how many Venezuelan boats have been shot up in the last couple weeks? I have no idea. 2 or 3, so 2 or 3. And a dozen people total, or 4 or 5 on each? Do we have any idea? Say again?
About a dozen.
Okay, so like on each one kind of thing, or just across the total? So we've killed 12, we'll just take this as the working example. We've killed 12 people, 4 on each, average. 12 divided by 12 divided by 3 is 4, right? Isn't that the case? Thank you. So yeah, at least here in Illinois it is. So 3 boats, 4 people each. We've killed them all, and I think the American in us regrettably says, well, they're just a bunch of drug-running scumbags, so get rid of them. And that's, maybe that's true. But the reality is, the Catholic position is, can we say, first of all, that the damage, not that Venezuela, whatever they're alleged to be doing, but can these 3 boats possibly in any universe be alleged to have causing harm to the United States that would warrant what is effectively what I would say is an illegal summary execution? Yes, sir.
The first boat had enough fentanyl to kill 1 million Americans.
And that's, so the argument is the first boat had enough fentanyl to kill 1 million Americans. So let's take that as a given. We'll move to the next point, the last resort point. Was incinerating the boat and killing 4 people the right way to go? Could the boat not have been interdicted? We do have a Coast Guard. Could the Coast Guard not have captured the boat, interdicted the drugs, taken the 4 guys, either extradited him or brought him for trial in the United States? I don't think anyone would object to a genuine, not what they used to say in the Old West, give him a fair trial and execute him, but some kind of actual law enforcement process. I think that's the biggest issue is...
Take it off.
What's that? Well, that's the assumption.
The illegal people doing those things have more rights than the United States citizens that are following the law.
Well, that's very true, and I think so the comment for those of you in the back was the pressure from this side of the room is they'll either get off or these people are doing illegal things. Americans don't have the same rights they do. As I tell my son-in-law, who's a criminal defense attorney in Virginia, who's worked in that field for 12 or 13 years, who feels guilty half the time about the people he gets off. The point is, and I think this is a standard principle of law, the Catholic mindset is that law exists, and I picked this out of a book, I didn't come up with this phrase. Law exists to enable good people to live among bad. So law exists to promote virtue, and if there are certain procedural protections that we have, I think it's a very dangerous road to say, well, the 3 of us in this room can decide, here's 12 people who are entitled to no procedural process. We apparently were very certain about the amount of fentanyl on the boat, what they were going to do with it, when it was going to come. I'm not, but I admitted to you from the beginning, I don't have the facts on this. But if the argument is, well, the executive branch of the United States has the right to execute them, at what point does the executive branch have the right to execute any person that in whatever this process is that it goes through, or whatever its logic, to execute any one of us for a crime that they think we committed? Like if the minute you justify, well, we know that they're bad, so they're no process, no hearing, no trial, no arrest, no nothing, just literally incinerate the boat. When are any of us next? I mean, I'll give you another example. What's that?
Said Sodom and Gomorrah.
Sodom and Gomorrah, yes, but who was the executioner in that case?
The Creator.
Yeah, the one who claims to have power over life and death, right? One example is Guantanamo Bay. I'll go back to Iraq since that's where I can claim some expertise with the facts. We pulled a lot of alleged terrorists off battlefields in Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Libya, etc., and we put them in Guantanamo Bay in orange jumpsuits. Everyone remember the Guantanamo Bay thing? Anything, you know? So, and I happen, you know, you'll look askance at me. I saw a dirty look when I said my son-in-law was a defense lawyer. You'll give me even more of one here because I'm very close to a lot of military lawyers who were assigned as defense counsel for those terrorists. Now, since we're getting into some controversy, anyone think a terrorist shouldn't have a defense lawyer? Don't be shy. I don't mind. So the question is if we presume that the terrorist doesn't get a defense lawyer, who's making that decision? I mean, you're free to make it if you want. That's your opinion. But I may have done all kinds of things that you disapprove of. And then if someone comes to you and says, should that guy get a defense lawyer? You might say, well, no, he shouldn't either. So my point is, where does it stop? If the terrorist is going to be properly convicted and then maybe executed, should there not be a burden where the government has to prove what he did wrong? And if the government proves it and the legitimate authority, again, under this fifth commandment, the death penalty is a legitimate, response to crime, should the government not have the burden of proving that the person it wants to execute did the crime? I mean, it seems to me that's, that's ultimately what the defense lawyer is for. The defense lawyer is not to make the guilty go free. The defense lawyer is to make sure that when the gas chamber gets filled up with its gas or the electricity gets turned on in the electric chair, they have the right person in the chamber and the right person in the chair, and that there's been a burden that's been met to prove that the person did what they're alleged to have done. And I think that's the issue ultimately for me with the Venezuelan executions is it's very easy for us to say they're here and they're going to kill everyone, but that's no different than what we heard. I mean, Colin Powell was saying that Saddam had airplanes with sprayers that were going to come spray poison gas over Manhattan. We heard the most ludicrous, unsupported with all the intelligence and all the military technology. I can tell you we all knew that there were no airplanes with sprayers that were going to spray poison gas on Manhattan. But we were told that, and I guess to come back to the Venezuela thing for a minute, I start to think to myself, well, if that's what they're telling us in this scenario, I mean, I don't have an axe to grind about the drug dealing and all that. I'm not in favor of drug dealing. I'm not in favor of Americans getting killed, so don't mistake me on that. But I think that it's a very slippery slope to go down to say, well, the commander-in-chief and his two advisors can decide who to execute. Yes, ma'am. Were you going to say something? Yeah, no, because you look like you're on the verge of speaking, so speak up when you're ready. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
How do you think Israel should have responded when they were attacked by Hamas?
October 7th.
October.
And you can give detail.
Yeah.
Of how people had their heads cut off, how children were dragged out of their houses, how people were taken and sent across the border and put in prisons and describe all that.
So what
and
would
then
be the
come back.
proper response?
Well, again, when I mentioned Israel, I'm talking about Israel and Iran, right? I to be honest with you, have
Hamas.
Yeah. What's that?
Iran. Who's feeding Hamas? Does Hamas have oil?
Well, I know, but you're
That's what Iran does.
Yes, but respectfully, you remind me of a few of these guys in the DOD from 20 years ago, like Feith and Wolfowitz and others, who said, we know they have centrifuges, we know we have tubes, we know they have this, we know they have that, we know they have the other. Let's come back for a minute to the United States. Whatever happened on October 7th, and I'm a skeptic, I'll be honest with you. I don't trust what the mainstream media feeds me because I watched with my own eyes the mainstream media. If anyone remember the name Judith Miller? Does that ring any bells at all? No, if you don't mind, let me answer. I don't want to describe October 7th because I don't know a lot of the details about October. If you'd like to, please come up and describe it for us. But what I'm trying to do two things. Number one, to address what's the United States response? Because we're Americans, right? We're not Israelis. We're not talking about whether the United States has the right to defend itself from an armed attack. The attack on October 7th, take it to the most extraordinary extreme lengths that you wish. That was not an attack on the United States, as far as I'm concerned. Would you say that it is?
No, it wasn't.
No, I agree. I agree. Say again?
It was an attack on the United States, but I don't think everyone should wait until it comes to your neighborhood.
Well, I absolutely agree with that, but I think then we're back to the example where, and the comment, for if you didn't hear it, was don't wait until it comes to your neighborhood. So in other words, if Hamas does what they do on October 7th, in order to not wait for them to come to this neighborhood, what would you suggest?
That's what I'm
Give
asking
full
you.
support to
Yeah, and that's supporting Israel is a different subject than the just war doctrine, isn't it? Or is it? I mean, I personally don't agree with that. I don't agree. I will just be blatantly honest with you and say that my study of the history of the Middle East is such that there was a conflict produced in 1945, 46, 47, 48, based on the British telling the Zionist Jews that they could move to Israel. And you were familiar with the Balfour Declaration? Anyone ever heard of the Balfour? So Balfour, this was one of the heads of state in Britain, the head of the foreign ministry, who said that because the British were in charge of Palestine at that point, right after World War II, and the British said to the Zionist Jews, "We support a homeland for you in Palestine. However, you may not prejudice the religious, civil, moral, and political rights of the indigenous population." The Arabs were terrorized by the Israelis, or before the Jews, before they became Israelis, in 1945, 46, 47, 48. It's not a conspiracy theory. You can go to Wikipedia, which is notorious for not being, it's not an anti-Jewish publication. Wikipedia is, if anything, it's the other way. And they will detail the acts of terror, and I mean cold-blooded terror, bombings of British embassies, bombings of hotels, terrorizing of Arab families, and the Palestinians were forcibly expelled, the same way we Americans are accused of treating the Native Americans and pushing them, the Trail of Tears and all those stories. What was done to the Palestinians was 1,000 times worse than that. And my view is that kicked off a conflict which is still unsettled. It's still unsettled. And I'm apologize for being blunt, but my subtlety has left me for a moment. All I would say is when you talk about a conflict that lasts that long, some of my close Irish friends have stories for me about their 800-year struggle to stop being terrorized by the English. It started in the 1100s and it ended more or less in 1922. So that whole Israel-Palestine thing is I think, the question is this a question of just war doctrine between nations? Or is this an occupied indigenous population with a colonizing power that's moved in that has reaped a whirlwind of problems? That to me is a whole separate question. What interests me as an American is when the Israelis launch an attack on Iran, the evidence about their funding of Hamas I think is highly questionable, but let's take your point and say it's completely true. That's between the Israelis and the Iranians. If the Iranians are funding Hamas and the Israelis attack the Iranians, there's probably an argument that the Iranians can fight back. And then if there's this conflict between Iran and Israel, does Uncle Sam have to bomb Iran? Is there any just war logic in us bombing Iran? Because the Israelis and the Iranians are in a fight that grows from 80 years worth of conflict with the Arabs.
When you say bombing,
Yeah.
it's a strategic bomb put down to keep them from creating a nuclear bomb.
Right.
If they had a nuclear bomb, God help the U.S., God help Israel.
I don't think that's true because, just in the light of history,
It's
we
not like
didn't.
bombing like you were bombing cities.
I'm not.
Civilians.
Yeah, I get that. And as I said earlier, my understanding is that no one was killed at all in that, and I think that's something as Catholics we should be happy with, that no one was killed. Like, we don't want people to be killed, do we? And like in general? Would you agree?
No, I don't want war either.
Right.
But at some point, there are occasions.
Right. And what
Stand up
I agree, and what I have utterly failed to do in the last hour is to persuade you that the just war doctrine, when the United States examines the case for taking a single aggressive act against Iran, what are the criteria? And the criteria are not that Iran is in an exchange with some other nation with which, to my knowledge, we don't have. We don't. It's not like Article 5 of NATO that says we all sign a paper that if this guy's attacked, we consider it an attack on us. We don't have that relationship with Israel. We were not attacked by Israel, by Hamas, by Iran, by any of them, unless you know something different.
So you're saying, okay, in Germany, they were killing all the Jews, but the United States should not get involved.
Yeah, well, we always go there. I mean, first of all, the United States got involved when Hitler declared war against us, first of all. That's my thing about the declaration. So I don't believe I said anything about what the Germans were doing and what the U.S. should have done in response to what they were doing in their own country. That is a piece of low-hanging media fruit. Like anytime there's an argument about a war Uncle Sam needs to get into, eventually, you know, the debater's on the ropes and he says, what about the Holocaust? I mean, it has nothing to do with what we're talking about. What we're talking about is that World War II was kicked off because the English had a treaty with Poland, which they got in place very quickly, knowing that Hitler was going to take a slice of Poland. They quickly signed a paper to make sure that as soon as Hitler invaded Poland, England would have an excuse to declare war against Germany. And that's a long-standing rivalry that is probably off the subject for everyone else. My point, however, is regardless of what's going on between the Arabs and the Israelis, which is a conflict that started back in the 1940s and obviously is far from over, and that triggers a third party to get involved. The Israelis did commit an act of aggression against the Iranians. The Iranians responded. Where is the just? I mean, you as an American citizen might think we need to be aggressive and we need to go after them. My submission to you is that the just war doctrine does not permit the United States to commit an act of aggression against Iran, because there was no act of aggression threatened towards or committed against the United States. And it's that simple. The rest is politics.
All right. We're going to stop here. I mean, it's 8:30, guys, so I'm going to give a final blessing. But, Commander, are you willing to stick around?
I'll stick around until everybody wears me out.
All right, we're going to give you guys a final blessing. We'll dismiss those who want to go home. But if you want to continue to talk with Commander, he'll be right up in front, and you're welcome to have further conversation with him. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory be to the Father.
And to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was at the beginning, is now, and shall be, world without end. Amen.
May Almighty God bless you, protect you, and keep you safe. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you,
Have a
Father.
good night. Commander, if you could just turn off the mic.
Will do.